Hi, everybody. We continue with our Lenten study, which is based on this book by Mike Graves, Jesus' Vision for Your One Wild and Precious Life. We now are exploring chapter 4, You Give Them Something to Eat. Even if you haven't picked up the book, hopefully this provides a little bit of an overview to give you an appreciation of some of his thoughts and to make you rethink a little bit about the Lent season and what often is the focus of the Lent season, and his take that we have been focusing on the wrong pieces in Lent, and we really should be focusing on the life and ministry of Jesus. So what he calls the first 6 words, or the first 6 lessons or teachings or moments or episodes in Jesus's life. And that gives us a much greater appreciation of how in Jesus we are capable of living our one wild and precious life, and how these really are touchstones for approaching issues that exist and have existed since the time of Jesus, but certainly exist now: poverty, hunger, polarization, inclusion, and more. So chapter 4 is entitled, You Give Them Something to Eat, Feeding the Hungry. He always starts with a quote, and this one is from Mahatma Gandhi. There are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread. So that's the quote that he begins with. He always circles back to that quote, and so I like to provide it for you so that you have it there in your head again. Again, from Mahatma Gandhi, there are people in the world so hungry that God cannot appear to them except in the form of bread. Now, he begins by sharing anecdotes about trips that he and his wife have taken to Italy, specifically how much he enjoys the food of Italy, but also talking about a church that he visited on one of the occasions that he went to Italy. And that church is the Church of Saint Apollinare Nuovo, which houses the earliest surviving life story of Jesus, which is encapsulated on 26 different panels within the church, 13 on each side of the nave of the church. And his reflection was, in visiting this church, interestingly, among those 26 panels, there is no panel that has the death of Jesus or that has the corpse of Jesus, anything associated with those final moments of Jesus's life. So no crucifixion, no taking down of the corpse, sealing it in the tomb, none of that. It goes right from the episode of Simon the Cyrene carrying the cross of Jesus to the hillside that is there, and then jumps right to resurrection. And so he's asking us as readers, well, why is there no crucifixion? Here's this earliest depiction of the life of Jesus, and something that we say is the most important thing isn't represented in this earliest depiction. Well, why is that? And that kind of comes full circle to why he crafted this study in the first place. It's not there because it doesn't really represent the most important things, particularly for early Christians, for the early church. His death was not central to the earliest followers, and images of his death and corpse really don't appear in art, predominantly in art. There are some early moments, but it is not a prominent part of incorporation into art, or for that matter, into worship space, for nearly 1,000 years of the church's history. So it's not until the church has been around, the Christian movement has been around for near 1,000 years, that becomes a more dominant piece of art. But in these early forms, absent completely. And he says that's because 3 dominant things are present within what we find in the early church. And that is the teachings of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, and the feeding ministry of Jesus. Jesus was all about healing and feeding people when he wasn't teaching them. So those 3 things really are the dominant focus of the life and ministry of Jesus, and so the dominant focus of the early church that became the body of Christ to the world after his resurrection. So that's, again, the teaching, the healing, and feeding. And I said this past Sunday, these things often are happening in concert with one another. So it's not so easy just to pair off one piece of this and go, okay, we can look at this. It's often the feeding moments also had teaching moments and also had healing moments. And so they incorporated all collectively. Gravesend goes back to Italy and his trips with his wife to Italy to talk about the joy of food that he experienced during his travel to Italy. I know I can share that myself. I spent a May term in Italy, and the food of Italy is fantastic. He shares anecdotes to encourage us to, in our own imaginations, to travel to moments where there has been great joy in eating. There have been feasts. There have been where we can still taste that great meal that we had, and also the experience of the company that we shared. And with that, he says, it is a truth that we have to eat to live, and part of living is eating. And we can see this truth bear out in the biblical narrative. So he peppers in a few scriptures to try to showcase the presence and prevalence of food throughout the biblical narrative, from the Hebrew Bible, the 23rd Psalm, which has imageries of feast and overflowing cups within it, that he says also is heavily influences the feeding miracle, which becomes really the focal point of this chapter here. And promised future feasts that are present, whether that's the 23rd Psalm that hints at that, or others. So it's part of God's intention, is his reading and hope, that all of humanity, in living their one wild and precious life, that we might flourish, that we might enjoy, that we might really be able to savor the flavor, if you will, that we might have this feast and fellowship with each other. Quotes E.B. White, most famously known for being the author of Charlotte's Web, who wrote, "I arise in the morning torn by a desire to save the world and a desire to savor the world. This makes it hard to plan the day. If we forget to savor the world, what possible reason do we have for saving the world?" He then launches into what really represents the core part of this chapter, at least the core scripture that's defining to this chapter, and that's the feeding of the multitude. Feeding of the multitude, or the feeding of the 5,000, or however you read it, how many are counted. There are 6 different accounts of the feeding of the multitude peppered through the 4 Gospels. It is the most prominent and repeated story. That lends it a lot of weight in the sense that it appears more than any others, more than even just 4 times, one in each Gospel. There's 6 times, so we have it duplicated in Gospels, that there are multiple accounts of the feeding of the multitude. Using one, he focuses on 2 particularly. I'm going to focus on Mark, the first of the ones that he focuses on, but he also does mention the feeding miracle in John's Gospel. But in Mark's Gospel, it's in chapter 8, his followers, they're called apostles in the account that we have, but those who had been sent out to the countrysides to share the different things that Jesus has empowered them with, come back, and they're ready to get some rest and rejuvenation. They head off in a boat in order to go to a quiet place to be by themselves, and when they dock on the other side, they're met with a huge crowd. Jesus has compassion on that crowd, proceeds then to interact with them, to teach them. The hour grows late. The disciples say you need to send them off so that they can have their needs met, and his statement back to them, or his teaching back to them, is you give them something to eat. Their rebuttal is that it would take a year's wage and still there wouldn't be enough, and in account of what they have, which is very little, 5 loaves and 2 fish, he then takes that and shares that with that gathered crowd, which has been set into smaller groups, smaller fellowship groups, for the distribution of that food. Then when all is done, they take up what is left over. It amounts to 12 more baskets full of broken pieces or leftover food. Food was broken, distributed, leftovers collected. So what do we do with that story? That's the first thing that he says after sharing the content of this story. Again, it's from Mark chapter 8. Do we debunk it in the sense of it's not possible? Do we defend it, just simply chalking it up to this is a miracle of God and that's enough to explain it? Or, as he proposes, there might be a third way to approach it, and that's the story told through the miracle. Not the story of the miracle, but the story that's told through the miracle. What is it trying to teach us? So asking ourselves that, as we approach and read the story. What is this trying to teach us? Not just being informational or factual, but what is it trying to teach us as followers of Jesus? And that a vision for this wild and precious life we are living is to enjoy good food, yes, and to make sure that that is true for everyone and not just for those who have the benefit of wealth to be able to be at such feasts. He uses that as a way to contrast two banquet stories that we have next to each other. One is the story of the beheading of John the Baptist, which appears in the halls of power, that is directly before this feeding miracle. And so it's only power brokers, you might say, that are in that are enjoying that food, but a pretty macabre scene that we have. And that's juxtaposed against the miracle that Jesus has in the feeding of these who are largely forgotten by the same system, who don't enjoy that kind of feast and festivity, that those who the system have forgotten. And so what Jesus here is proposing or showing us is a system, a way in which all are equal, and there is no distortion based on economics or religious standing or some other status, but rather all are able to enjoy the feast. So we have to have the imagination, which is lacking in Philip in John's account of the feeding of the multitude, which is where he pivots then from that. The imagination of a feast, even in the wilderness, even in places where it doesn't appear that there is enough to meet the needs. And that we have a formula there also, which might help unlock our imaginations. The taking, the giving thanks to God, the breaking, and then the sharing or the giving out to the people. And that this formula is what comes to be represented in what we call Eucharist or Holy Communion, that we still repeat this same formula. And that this episode, or these 6 episodes, and Paul's recounting of Eucharist and communion becomes the major part of worship of the early church, is this sharing of food in this formula of giving thanks, of taking, giving thanks, breaking, and giving out. And the taking often was things that came from the people who were assembled, lifting it to God, that God may use it as God sees fit, and then breaking it and distributing it to the people. Jesus gives it away for free, so also communion, or likewise other foods, should be given away for free. Now he quotes Soren Kierkegaard, a philosopher, to say that Jesus is interested in followers, not admirers, and that it's not hard to understand Jesus, which is what often is said, but it's hard to follow or to live what Jesus has. So I go back to the instruction, you give them something to eat. It's not hard to understand, but somehow it's hard to live. And that really is the teaching, that third avenue of understanding the miracle of the feeding narrative. That feasting includes everyone. That the miracle is that we all have something to spare. And however we find a means to do that, whether that's handing out cookies, and he uses a lot of different anecdotes here, handing out cookies, carrying a few extra things with us always that we might distribute it to those who have need, bottle of water, a few granola bars, something like that. Whether it's giving in a different way or participating in a feeding ministry, such as our little free food pantry here at church, or the mobile food pantry express that we host every Monday, whether it's collecting formula for the Durham Memorial Maternal Stress-Free Zone. Those are things that we have participated in. They're just examples. He gives lots of personal anecdotes of people in his life and the choices that they've made relative to feeding ministries as a way of understanding that what Jesus is calling us to, you give them something to eat, is to an inclusive sharing with everyone, that we all have something to spare, and finding a way to do that. Alongside of that, he does encourage us to also recognize that these feeding miracles include being with the people there, not just meeting the needs of the people there, but being with them, accepting them, sitting down. So in these fellowship groups, really understanding ourselves as part of the same. He concludes this chapter with a couple of quotes. Audre Lorde, "Our children cannot dream unless they live. They cannot live unless they are nourished. And who else will feed them the real food without which their dreams will be no different than ours?" Very potent scripture. And then a final anecdote from a pastor. I'm going to spare the full quote because it includes a little bit of profanity for emphasis. But the pastor in the sermon was sharing the statistics of how many children died while people slept overnight. I divided that a little bit to fit within the confines of the time that you've spent with me in this video. And that would be, while you have participated in this, about 400 children have died of starvation or disease. And the pastor in this sermon talked about how many died while people slept, and actually our number is off. This quote is 30,000 kids died of starvation or disease related to malnutrition. That's just why people were sleeping overnight. And then the second part of this quote is most of you don't care, but he doesn't use the word don't care. He uses a swear word. And his point, this pastor's point, was that more people would be bothered and offended by the use of the swear word than the fact that 30,000 children had died last night while they slept. This goes back to Jesus saying, you give them something to eat, and us really sitting with that and understanding the vision for our one wild and precious life is to feast together with all, and that all means all, and to find ways and means to do that. Let me share with you the reflections or the questions that he has at the end of this chapter, and then we'll be back together next week for chapter 5. So number 1, feeding people is one of the essential things about Jesus' life, appearing 6 times in the 4 Gospels. How does this repeated stress on feeding hungry people speak to you? Have you participated in any feeding ministries? What was that experience like? I want to encourage you with these questions that you might pause the video and write down some of your responses. Or if you are with somebody next to you as you are viewing this, you'd pause the video and have a little bit of conversation or discussion over each of the different questions. Number 2, debunking and defending miracle stories are familiar strategies for rereading the Bible. What do you make of the alternative approach, focusing more on the point of the stories? Number 3, the feeding stories echo the language of communion, which for a lot of people means private devotion and worship. What do you make of the justice implications of Jesus's banquet versus Herod's banquet? So Herod's banquet was the banquet in which I referenced earlier, where the head of John the Baptist appeared, where there was all power brokers. So that's the reference here, is juxtaposing the two banquets that stand side by side in the gospel. Number 4, in John's gospel, Jesus produces 120 gallons of wine and bread for thousands, and in the feeding story, there are leftovers. What are your reflections on this abundance? Number 5, are there particular phrases, quotes, stories, or images that stand out to you from this chapter on Jesus feeding hungry people? How do these things speak to the way you hope to live your one wild and precious life? What about some wild and precious dreams related to hunger? And number 6, is there an image, a poem, or a song that comes to mind reflecting what feeding and welcoming hungry people might look like? Tap into your inner artist if you dare and create your own piece. Again, we'll be back together next week for chapter 5. I hope you're finding this engaging and stretching you a little bit in this season of Lent as part of our collective discipline of connecting with God and growing in our faith through this season. God bless you all, and we'll see you next week.